This is a nice unfolding of people into digital space. But I'm really glad to have everyone here. I'm glad that each of you were able to join this panel. As Hector said, my name is Matthew Claudel, and I am the founder of a strategic design agency based in Portland, Oregon, that's focused on civic value, and it's called Field States. And it's my joy to be on this panel, to be hosting this panel together with all of you, because I think each of you brings an interesting and different perspective to the question of spatial data and what that means for mobility. So I thank you all for being here, and I'm excited for a great conversation. As a general point of order, please feel free to add your thoughts, even if I haven't specifically asked you a question. I hope that this becomes a conversation and not just an interview. And feel free to riff on each other while also maintaining some respect for people to finish their thoughts and share what they have to say. So I am going to start off with a quick round of introductions. I prompted you to think about something over the weekend, and that prompt was to describe a distinctive interaction that you've had with digital public infrastructure, positive or negative. What made it remarkable? And starting us off, Scott, why don't you answer that question? Scott is the project manager of operations data at Cal-ITP, which is a brilliant unit within Cal-ITP at the state level in California, doing innovative work in transportation technology. But Scott, I'll let you tell us more about that.
Thank you, Matthew. Cal-ITP, we are approximately 4 years into a really exciting and innovative research and development project within the state of California's Department of Transportation. It has involved a lot of data standards work, interoperability work, and a lot of really exciting collaborations, both with agencies inside California and with organizations and agencies outside of California as well, trying to improve public transportation for everyone, regardless of how they access it. And when it came time for me to think about my remarkable experience with public data infrastructure, this almost felt like too easy of a choice. And yet I felt as an Angelino, it was incredibly true to form. I was thinking about riding the metro in Los Angeles, the metro subway system here. And it is a very common grievance that Angelinos share, that the arrival predictions on the subway stations are frequently what we refer to as the random number generator. You'll have an excellent experience of watching the countdown clock tick away to 0. No train comes, and then it goes up to a seemingly randomly chosen number, somewhere between 5 and 25 minutes in the future. And you just have to say, I mean, have I waited long enough? Is it too late to change course? That is indelible in my mind, because it gives me a very particular sense of dread and anxiety.
Incredible anecdote. Maybe that's something we can fix today in the panel. We'll get that solved for you, Scott.
Thank you.
Next up, Ryan, can you introduce yourself? And Ryan is, I think, perhaps unique on this panel because he's wearing a couple different hats. One of them is at MBTA in Boston and across Massachusetts, the Transportation Authority, where he's the director of technology, and also at, Consumer Technology Department. And then you're also at Transit Ops, which is a brilliant company that's kind of reimagining service level infrastructure for transit. So can you tell us more about those things?
You should do my introductions always, because that just sounds way better than what I actually do. No, so in the MBTA, I'm a part of the Customer Technology Department, which I think is fairly unique in public transit because we are somewhat product focused, and we do spend a lot of resources building digital systems that we need to meet rider expectations that we often find that the sort of vendor marketplace doesn't do, and we kind of fill gaps there. So we build all that as open source, and Transit Ops is not directly affiliated with the MBTA, but Transit Ops is trying to get more transit agencies to utilize open source effectively. And so much of the open source is open source produced by the MBTA, but not limited to that. And so yeah, there's a little there's a relationship there. In terms of, I forget exactly how you put it, but this remarkable story. I think I have a lot of stories I thought would be interesting, but one of them is like really timely. In our region at the moment, riders are experiencing slowdowns for various reasons, right? And this is a major frustration, as you can imagine, to the riding public to be accustomed to a trip taking a certain amount of time for years and years and years, and all of a sudden it's double that or whatever it may be, depending on the trip that they're taking. As someone working in public transit, ideally, you would also be using public transit. Not always the case, unfortunately. In my case, it is true. And the line that would be most close to where I live was very much affected by this. And I found myself in this unique position of both being part of the organization that is publishing the data about the system that groups could use to actually very specifically understand the type of slowdowns, and sort of being on the consumer side. There's a group in our area called Transit Matters, and they've produced some really remarkable dashboards consuming our open data to kind of articulate and show their concerns and the concerns of many riders, which I feel was pretty effective in advocating back to the agency and making the agency do their best to be responsive, right? So I think in the context of what we're here talking about today with open data, it was interesting to ensure that this data is available to everybody who wants it, but in particular this group that built this remarkable tool that was showing the impact of slow zones over time, and then it had this effect for the public to better understand. Because without this data, I think many members of the public would obviously know that something is up, but I feel like giving this data to an advocacy agency that's able to really show exactly what's happening and how it's changed really helped control the discussion towards urgent problems. So I'll stop talking, but that's my story.
Yeah, no, we'll certainly get into that question of publishing data and the relationships between public agencies and other organizations. I next up would love to introduce Victoria. Victoria is leading client services. She's a VP of client services at Ellis and Associates, which is a subsidiary of Lacuna Technologies that's in the interest of the public good, doing transportation data consulting. And Victoria, if you could share with us your distinctive interaction that you've had with digital public infrastructure, we'd love to hear it.
Oh, sure. And by the way, I work a lot with Los Angeles as a customer. So Scott started talking, I was like holding my breath for a second. I was like, oh, this is going to be a project that I worked on? No, wasn't. Okay. So, one of mine sort of has stood the test of time, and it's like not very cool, but I love it, which is EasyPass. And I love EasyPass because it's one of those things that sort of still just works. I think it's one of those solutions where there's no screen interaction, which is something that's hard to do. And it's such an intuitive thing it's valuable on the sort of infrastructure side, but it's intuitive and very low touch for the user. They don't have to download anything, they don't have to learn anything. And it's, it always sort of seems like a very elegant solution, and you just have that little box in your car and it all just works.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. You kind of not defaulting to the premise that something needs to be a mobile app is quite interesting in this context, especially when you think about addressing the broadest of user groups, which transportation has to do. Amenity. Amenity Applewhite is the head of product at Austin Transportation Department. So I'd love for you to tell us about what that means and share your experience with us.
Sure. Hi, happy to be here. So I'm the head of product on the Data and Technology Services Division at the Austin Transportation Department. So we are a team within the department that does internal technology and data services that the city's kind of central IT department can't provide. So we leverage high quality data and modern technologies to support our staff, empowering them to improve operations, make data informed decisions, and deliver excellent mobility services to the Austin community. We like to say that we solve real problems for real people, because I think when you get into the kind of smart cities realm of things, you can get into a whole lot of kind of theoretical stuff. And when we are thinking about what our team does, it's really like we're taking paperwork orders for the arterial management division signal operators who are out in the field and digitizing those so that we have spatial data of where our traffic signals are and that type of thing. So real problems, real people. And when I was thinking about this prompt, I actually went back to my days before I was a municipal employee, when I was just an engaged citizen, and I was going to the city's website for one of the first times to register my group, my neighborhood group. So it's there was a form there where we kind of put the name of our neighborhood group, and it's just this digital form, and it gets to the area where you are defining the kind of geographic extent of it. And as a spatial data person, my heart kind of shattered because I saw this like free text field that said northern boundary, and this free text field that said eastern boundary, and then southern boundary, western boundary. And I was just thinking, like, I don't want to submit this data. This data is useless. Like, what's going to happen with this data? Lo and behold, when I actually start at the city, I am actually sitting on the other side of a cubicle wall from the person who receives this data and then calls the people and says, so wait, do you mean Waller Creek? Do you mean this and that? And then so she kind of takes a screenshot of Google Maps, and like then she sends it over to a GIS team that like is then going to hand digitize this data. And I just checked, this is like 8 years later, and it's still like this data set is available as public data, but it still doesn't have any spatial data in it. And I don't really wonder why, because it wouldn't be high quality data to begin with. And so this was just a really big reminder to me of like when open data misses the opportunity to be digital public infrastructure, like instead of this being useful data, instead of this being a data set that I could query or make kind of, you know, I'm moving to an area and I can see what neighborhood groups could I join because here's my new address. This data is being supplied, but it's kind of completely useless, but still taking staff hours, still, you know, being put out on a database, but not doing anyone any good.
Thank you. Thanks, Amenity. Finally, Ben. Ben is the president of the Foundation for Public Code, perhaps the least transit native person, but also thinking very deeply about digital public infrastructure through the foundation. So Ben, can you introduce yourself and share a little anecdote?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and thanks all of you guys for being here. This is great. So the Foundation for Public Code is a international nonprofit chapter based in which we help public administrations collaborate on building digital public infrastructure software. I think Amenity's example is a perfect example of why I find that the conversation often about open data is really about open code, because the problem there is not in the data. The problem is in the mechanism for gathering the data, and that's the code. And so I think for a long time, this, you know, we've had, especially from vendors, a focus on open data, which is great. They're like, oh, here's your open data. Well, it's like, how did you generate that? Oh, well, that's closed. That's actually a huge problem. So I think sort of, you know, swimming upstream is kind of what we've been doing for a while, and that, you know, sort of realizing that the source of all of this is in the code. And so trying to build pieces of digital public infrastructure that function as, you know, very useful pieces of things like transit infrastructure as collaboratively produced open code, I think is really a fantastic project. And so the example I'm giving is one that's like a little bit cheating because it's an alpha of coming from one of the entities that we're working with, which is the province of South Holland in the Netherlands has implemented something. I'm curious to see how the closed captioning deals with these Dutch names, but this product is called Omgevingsbeleid, and it's based on a law in the Netherlands called the Omgevingswet, which is a law about unified spatial data index. So if you produce spatial data in the public sector in the Netherlands now, you're required to submit the data types, basically a manifest of the data that you're producing to a national agency that can compile this into a queryable data set per location. So this Omgevingsbeleid is a reference implementation of a query system on that has a mapping interface that you just plonk down a pin, and it tells you in the the results panel what agencies are generating what data types and what the URL is to reference the live data source. And so this is like kind of an aspirational example of the sort of thing that I think is achievable in a lot of different domains of the public sector in a lot of different places, including in California and Oregon and various other places, Texas, so and nationally. So these are, but the point is that this type of infrastructure requires software on the back end that uses standard protocols and has very specific kind of interlocking parts, and that requires collaboration between entities, both internal to agencies within a single public administration and also across public administrations. And so that's kind of what the Foundation for Public Code focuses on, is building these types of communities of practice and the kind of the infrastructure, both social, between the agencies, the stakeholders within the agencies, but also infrastructural in terms of having shared code bases that serve as reference implementations for this kind of functionality. So I'm excited to think about, what are some of the prospects for the types of tooling that this group of people might be able to share and use in the future collaboratively.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so I'm excited to get into it. There are so many connections, and my head is spinning with what the right first question is. But I think we can start off with something that's quite popcorn, I think, and try and get everyone's perspective on this. So many of us here are focused on pushing the boundary of service delivery, and that's through specific use cases or kind of products, whether it's Scott, the countdown timer, or if it's the Easy Pass, or if it's actual kind of structural like bus networks and routing. And so I'm wondering about how we can push the envelope for such products. Also thinking, Ryan, about the supported apps that you have at Transit Ops, while also maintaining a baseline service delivery, right? Like you need to make sure that trips are happening A to B. And so how do you kind of play with that as a push and a pull, maintaining that service delivery while also pushing the boundary?
I mean, maybe I'll take a quick stab at this, but I'm definitely interested in what other people have to say about it. At the end of the day, any tech that we're involved in needs to have a foundation in sound user research, right? Sometimes I would say that we're doing something technologically that's maybe boring or it's been done before in other industries, but it needs to happen in this industry and we need to do it in a sustainable way. So sometimes when people ask these kind of innovation questions, I want to push back and say like, well, in government, sometimes the biggest innovation is being more responsive to the needs and concerns of the total various different demographics and populations of riders who use the system in different ways, right? To more directly answer a specific question, I think it's really possible. Like what we do, for example, we might change our algorithm that impacts the system that Scott was describing, right? Of the predictions that we generate about arrival times, right? So we would have a dev system that's going to show that has the same access to the live data, but we can see how our predictions change on the same data set and let that run for some period of time before we choose to either make an actual change in the prediction that the public will experience? Or, maybe someone had a great idea, and when we actually see it against multiple days worth of data, we can say, well, it actually helped here, but at certain parts of the trip, it's much worse. So we're not, we're not going to roll that out. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in because I feel like, I just want to kind of also build on something that Amenity said with your great example, which is, thinking about that usability, like thinking about the use cases that Ryan, you're mentioning, like really understanding what your user needs, but then really connecting that back to what does that mean you really need in terms of information and data, and trying to think about that in the most streamlined way possible in general, but also understanding, I think, the systems in the back end that you might be trying to get that data from. It's really, really easy to build big, beautiful things with tons and tons of features, but often those become very, very difficult to maintain, to your question, Matthew. And so it's like figuring out what's your highest value use, but then being really rigorous during that process of, can I do this with 3 data points? Do I really need it every day? Can the hardware that I might be trying to get information from, how reliable is that, so that you don't kind of create these weird quality problems in the pursuit of trying to make something great, but you've made something that's hard to be sustainable in the process.
Yeah,
I would say from our perspective in California, one of the things that we've considered to actually be our product is the data quality, and that is driving a lot of the decisions that are made and a lot of what we consider to be innovative in our approach. And I think we have the good fortune to sort of becoming midstream into work that a lot of other folks have done, a lot of really important foundational work. In the public sector, we have this tremendous blessing where we can fill in gaps where traditional market development is not necessarily going to touch the way that certain users get their information, just for example, because those users are too small of a group or do not represent significant enough revenue or return for the companies that are doing R&D. So at the top of the call, I mentioned that we kind of see ourselves as research and development within the state DOT at Cal-ITP, and I think the benefit of that is we're able to take what Ryan was saying to focus on the user research and product research from a much broader standpoint, and to say, if we're looking at data quality as the product that we're trying to deliver to Californians, to people who are just traveling through California, who is that actually capturing, and who within the existing ecosystem of data that's being served to those users, mobile devices, computers, et cetera, or is even, as in my anecdote, just being served to them at a transit station, who is not able to make use of good quality data to make the decisions that they need to make in the most abstract way possible.
To riff on that, it seems like in public transit, most of the opportunities you have to use digital technology to improve the rider experience ultimately boils down to your ability to get accurate data to people where they are and how they want to consume it. So Scott, I commend what you said, this idea that the data is the product, or the data quality is the product, because many times we've had, let's say, someone working on a project has a really great idea. Ultimately, they say, well, actually, we can't do that because the data isn't reliable or accurate enough that this thing that would be wonderful would actually be useful.
And I can pick up where you're leaving off there and just kind of say that as an largely internal facing team, our job, I think, is to kind of come in and look towards the staff and the engineers who want to be accountable, who are doing great work, and kind of help them understand that this kind of like specter of opening the data and showing their work and being transparent with how we're spending our money and what we're planning can actually be an incentive that their data doesn't have to be embarrassing, right? So off like what you were saying, Victoria, and both of you, Scott too, like having high quality data, narrowing the focus and saying, look, you don't have to show everything. You don't have to take this entire spreadsheet you were using and put it out there for everyone to see. But let's have a centralized system. Let's have a data structure that we're proud of, where we know our data can be modeled in a way that is useful, in a way that is standardized across our department. And let's start there, and let's start with capturing that and feeling good about that. And so when we are actually building solutions that is for the use of the staff, we're really looking at how do we help them maintain that data in a way that doesn't create extra work for them, in a way that helps them as they're doing their operations, as they're doing their work. It's giving them a benefit as well. It's not just a reporting mechanism that's an additional layer on top of what they have to do.
So I'd love to come back to interoperability and standard data formats, which is going to be an important topic for us to address. But quickly, there's a really interesting theme emerging here, and I've heard a couple people mention it, and that's fixing market failures. And part of our responsibility as public sector or public sector adjacent organizations is to think about what those market failures are, and then how data or specific products can fill them. And so I'm imagining a specific use case, which I know Boston has been a leader in, which is ordering wheelchair accessible vehicles. In Portland as well, it's actually a City of Portland or a Portland Bureau of Transportation website through which you can order a taxi. And that's a specific example of a market failure. Let's say there's not enough demand for those vehicles. And so I'm curious about how we think about the public-private sector relationship, because so often the data and the infrastructures we create as public agencies are the infrastructures upon which private sector actors can play. I want to open that up. That's a can of worms. Scott, maybe toss that one to you.
Sure, I'm happy to. Ben, it looked like you were going to say something, but if not, I'm happy to go.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have many thoughts on this topic. So I think for starters, yes, I do look at the work that we're doing with Cal-ITP as being centered around market failures. Honestly, things that the market just wouldn't touch, not out of particular malice, just because it would never. And I've been a product manager before for a private company, so I understand the JIRA backlog, right? Like just things that would never rise to the top of a smallish tech company, and almost all of the ones that we're talking about in the public transportation space are small from a global standpoint. So they have limited resources and would not necessarily be able to fix the problems that we see in any sort of timeline that most public agencies would find acceptable. That's been a recurring theme in the course of my work, hearing from agencies that, yeah, we have these problems. We've raised them a number of times, and it's just not a priority. So the question really is, have we as a public agency, and now really thinking about from the perspective of a state, it doesn't have to be a state as large as California, but just sort of having that macro level view of what's going on in transportation in a large-ish geographic area. Have we, from that perspective, actually defined these are the standards, not data standards, but these are the quality standards that we would actually expect for people interacting with this type of data within the realm of our purview? And is that something that is being communicated to the vendors? And if so, how is it being communicated to the vendors and private actors who are working on that? Because the private market, I want to say, like, we work with a lot of great private market partners who do incorporate a really great ideology around public transportation and have a sense of duty that they're going to support people of all types who are using public transportation. But however, so much that may be the case, it's never going to be the same as a public sector organization's ability to really give primacy of place to an idea like that, and to say the purpose of this goal, as on our data side of things, we say is the purpose of this work is going to be that everyone has a uniform, high quality standard of access. And if that becomes an organizing principle, then what is the downstream effect that needs to have on the market actors and the public transit agencies operating in that space? It is a powerful tool of figuring out how interests need to be aligned, and working backwards from there, you can figure out who your partners are going to be, what obstacles need to be overcome. It's not an instantaneous process, I can tell you that much, but it is.
That's a total setup for what I was actually hoping to contribute to this part of the conversation, which was the kind of reorientation around. I mean, you were saying standards are the thing that we need, that the public sector needs to project into the market, but I think, you know, specific asks, honestly, is something that the public sector is not very good at projecting, right? Like, most of the time when you're talking about products in things like transport, it's vendors showing up with the solution, and, you know, the public sector deciding whether they want to take it on. But I think that, you know, we need to pivot the conversation into something where there is enough technical sort of capacity, architectural capacity in the public sector to know what to ask for, right? And that's really this idea of, like, you know, and I think also, you know, when you're starting to talk about things like public code, this is one of the real powers of public code, is that it is, you know, if you build an open source product that is shared across administrations, then that actually is a big enough market ask. You know, like, if you come with a distributed procurement from like 4 or 5 different agencies from different places to say, hey, this is something we really need, the market will respond to that, because it's packaging, you know, a bunch of work into a single ask, and then you start to build an ecosystem of vendors around a product, you know, which almost looks a little bit more like Web 1.0 in a way. You have these things, you know, it was sort of the web server with all these people working on that. But if you imagine, like, one of the things Matthew and I have been imagining is there a way to have a embedded map server, you know, that runs on the last version of Mapbox that was still open source, you know, and is embeddable maps for all these different application spaces in the public sector, that's containerized and easily unboxable, and something like that. It would be useful to a lot of different, you know, sort of actors in the space. But the question is, can you you know, present that as a unified ask, you know, which then does bring the market to the table, right, in a way that they wouldn't otherwise if it was kind of a piecemeal ask, you know, among, you know, little sort of seats within different agencies. So the question to me, you know, like, Mariana Mazzucato is someone who's written amazingly about the idea that the state is a primary actor in a lot of innovation, just because it can bundle these asks, you know. And I think if we, you know, the idea that you have kind of a mission-based thing that's like, how do we solve spatial data for transport, you know, and if you can articulate that across the public sector, there's no reason that we can't all ask for that together from the market. And that would be a really amazing opportunity, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the spaces that, you know, I work in with my organization is mobility data around micromobility, aka scooters, which means that we've done a lot of work with what's called the mobility data specification, which is also excitingly transforming into its 2.0 life in the next month, which means it's not going to just be scooters anymore. It will be taxis and sidewalk robots. And other ride hail, which is like a huge evolution. But it's been remarkable to see what the Open Mobility Foundation, which is the governing organization for that specification, is very much conceived and has been successful, exactly what you're talking about, Ben, of being able to bring together civic leaders to create a unified voice to talk back to the technology and the vendor ecosystem. And there's been, you know, just incredible like moments of everybody sort of showing up and being like, hey, we really like, and that's a large part of why the specifications evolved beyond just scooters and micromobility, is all these cities that are the governing board actually for this technology foundation, which is also really unique and incredible. We're like, hey, this can't just be scooters. We need it to be all these other things. How do we prioritize that? But I've also seen vendors push back in some of those conversations healthily as well, when asking one city's like, we need this one use case and it's really important to us. Those vendors are now like, that's great. We haven't heard that from anybody else. Can we take this conversation to this forum? And if you can kind of bring a couple other cities to the table, we would like to develop this, but it's in the JIRA backlog. Otherwise, it's, you know, if we only hear from you, then it's going to sit in the JIRA backlog. But if you can show us that there's like a market or a need for it beyond like the things that we do for our own profitability, basically, you know, then yeah, it's on the table. That's great. But it's been amazing to sort of see where that's been working, where that's, you know, doesn't work in that little corner of the transportation in the very big transportation world.
You know, I'm going to try to make our discussion a little spicy here, and I'm going to respectfully disagree with our friend Ben, who I interpreted part of what you said is that maybe transit agencies or other government agencies aren't really asking the right questions, or they don't know what to ask. And so when they're not getting what they want for vendors, it's their own faults because they're idiots. I mean, all right, I'm going too far, but I think that I disagree. In my work, I'm able to interact with, you know, people who work at transit agencies across the US. And I think these people are brilliant and amazing, and they know what they want, and they're asking vendors for exactly what they want, and they're not getting it. In many cases. And of course, there are exceptions and so on and so forth, right? A really palpable example I could give is in the beginning of the pandemic, we wanted to provide data to riders about crowding on vehicles. Pretty straightforward, right? People want to know, should I get on this vehicle? Is it safe to socially distance? What can I do? This is data that has existed in public transit for a long time, but it hadn't typically been considered a type of real-time data that you'd be providing to riders all the time. So we reached out to our vendor who we knew had this information and said, hey, like, just give us a feed. How can we do that? You know, we really want to get this information to riders. Obviously, there's these safety concerns. Like, let's do this. We got money. We'll pay you, you know. And their response was something like, well, yeah, that sounds great. You know, I think we could give you that API in 1 or 2 years, right? Well, 1 or 2 years didn't cut it for us, right? So I don't want to say exactly what we did, but we figured out a way to get the data ourselves in like a week, right? And that costs the salary for, you know, 3 people for a week or something like that. So I do think there's different parts of the market, right? And probably with scooters, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of money, and there's things that are happening there. But in the more traditional public transit space, there's arguably, it's a small market. There's something like 35 big transit agencies in the US. How much money could they collectively pay to any company? I don't know, but I think that's probably a factor that holds back innovation on the vendor side. There's also this wild card thing of private equity in this industry, right? So a lot of companies in this space have been acquired by private equity firms. Well, I think the idea is, oh, this is great. These companies already have these government customers. It's really hard to switch off of these products. It's expensive. There's not much competition anyway. So you know what? Let's just milk it. You know what? Don't do anything for them. Let it ride, right? And so this sort of total disregard for the interests, concerns of transit agencies as customers, I think is very unique. I think a lot of private sector companies are dying to know what you want so they could make their product better. Not in this industry.
Well, I think that is exactly, I mean, in a way, I guess maybe I didn't phrase it right, because I think the thing that that needs to be asked for, that isn't asked for, I mean, maybe these people are brilliant, but the thing that hasn't transitioned to is asking for open products, right? Because like the thing that you just said is literally the consequence of not having open products. Like the idea that you are utilizing something that a huge network of administrations are spending a lot of money on, and it is collected as a proprietary product that has lock-in built into it, and therefore there is no innovation. And so the main thing that needs to be in this ask that, that we don't see yet, regardless of, how informed the people are in the public sector who are making these asks, they should be asking for open code bases, because then that means that they don't experience this lock-in, and they can also, the idea that you have something that is useful in the whole, and then you have a way of creating distributions that serve as, something specific for transit. Like, for instance, when I'm talking about this mapping, like an embedded mapping product, that is something that has utility across divisions. So it's something that's not just going to ask between the transit departments, and ask between, very large public administrations of all types to have an open mapping product. And then there, once you have that going, that in and of itself serves as a limit on the ability of those private lock-in based industries to continue to take advantage, because there's now an option that is open and can have local vendors. That's another part of the conversation that's really interesting, is that, if you have an open product, then you can have a studio that has literacy in the implementation of that product that is within the ecosystem of your local municipality, and you have a totally different relationship with them. So it's definitely, I definitely don't, I think you're right.
We've realigned.
Yeah, we made it back, but it was definitely one of those moments where I'm like, no, these people really need to adjust their ask. And the main adjustment to the ask is that it should be an open product that is the product of the work that's done as a public, RFP.
Yeah. Amenity, is this something that resonates with you and in your perspective with Cap Metro and product? Is this question of scoping the thing you need from the perspective of the end user, and maybe tying in a concept that came up in our introductions, which is that that actually a dashboard publishing data can incentivize or advocate for, let's say, the user experience, which is something that's a flywheel that starts to spin with an open product, and it's a flywheel that spins the other direction for a proprietary product.
Yeah, on my team, we don't work with transit data as much in terms of like Cap Metro data. That's kind of like its freestanding entity, since it's a separate group. But when I think about kind of these negotiations with the kind of what the market is providing and what we need and what would be helpful or serve us. I think about like the real-time road closure data. So when you think about kind of citizen generated data sets that are coming from Waze, and then the combination of those, how powerful it would be if we could have our right-of-way permits kind of available in the same platform. So when we have a road closure, whether it's for a day or an hour, that those were in a single data set, in a single data structure, to be able to provide that publicly. And so right now we're kind of like looking at vendor solutions and the direction that it kind of has to go, because there are these companies where they have that product, which is the data that they are collecting and the data that they're putting together, and they are going to add our data from our right of way to their product. And that's kind of like what's in it for us, because we get the data, but it gives us not necessarily, it's a weird place to negotiate from, right? It's like, okay, and then how pretty can you make this for us, or how real time can you make this for our staff? And so that's a project that's like kind of just opening up right now. But what, I think the way that we will have to approach it is really from the perspective of our end users, so the city staff, and then the people who are actually holding these permits, and see, how we can evaluate it from there. But it's something we're just starting to look into.
Ben mentioned like asking vendors to make their code available or open source, which I 100% agree with. Even incrementally, there's some instances in government where government doesn't even own their own data. They've entered into an agreement with a vendor, and you get the service from the vendor. And if you want to get access to or use your what you would normatively believe is your own data, you have to pay even more every time you want to touch it or look at it. And so I think, I mean, I hope people can move more in the direction of open source. I think the open, like the owning your own data part is probably less controversial or like less defensible. Like it definitely, like once you say, so every time I want to like just access this, I have to pay you again and again and again. That seems to be like vendors will like cave on that.
Good
But,
point. Yeah. And I'm not sure I want the data for these applications that they're selling. Sorry, I'm not sure I want the code. I'm not sure I want this like cold fusion code for like this thing that they're like consuming. But yes, the data very much, if in those contracts specifically where yeah, having some verbiage that we could reuse around that would be really useful.
Victoria, I see you've unmuted.
I just want like plus 100 to Ryan.
Yeah. And I wonder if
notes.
the
Yeah, no, I think it's
standardization.
so I just think the ownership part is so important too. I think, you know, as a private company that supports a lot of governments with their data, we, you know, feel super strongly that it's sort of on behalf, and, you know, and then whether it's during the course of the project or the end of the project, it's you know, transferred. But I know that that's not as commonplace as I think we wish it was as a standard practice between public sector and private sector. And, you know, on both sides, the private sector, I think, being thoughtful about that and volunteering it, and the private and the public sector, you know, sort of making sure to ask for it as well, and putting that into procurement like requirements.
And I wonder, and speaking of procurement requirements, and now you're starting to see requirements for standard data formats like MDS. And so I want to return to the power of that, not only in kind of standardization across jurisdictions, but also in conditioning the relationship between public sector and companies. Where if you have a standardized data format, you can start to ask for that data in a consistent way and start to compare across different service providers, for example. You also can start to bleed out into other sectors. MDS is now looking at a curb specification, which I think is brilliant and interesting as a function of these different uses of the public right-of-way. So many of us here have had an experience of MDS as a kind of poster child for transforming this. But Victoria, I know you've worked with that quite in depth. Is that correct?
Yes, got the like wonderful front row seat of working with LADOT sort of in the beginning of the scooter, like the big scooter deployments, and they're very much the leader and the wrangler of both the initial specification and then the development of the Open Mobility Foundation. So I feel like I had a really unique front row seat on the specification development, which we work a lot with as a company as well.
So opening it up, I mean, what have we started to see in terms of interjurisdictionality between different regions as a function of standardized data? And can we think about additional standards or additional harmonization and what that would mean for interjurisdictional relationships?
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount of value there, and just, you know, thinking about the interoperability, you know, as both the interoperability and the ability to have more flexibility in like a vendor ecosystem. It creates a scenario where, you know, it doesn't create identical deployments, but, you know, anybody who's a vendor in the space, if you are, you know, a city customer, you have a certain amount of confidence that whether you're using software from my company or one of our many, you know, amazing competitors, you know, you're going to see the same type of, you're sort of getting the same basis of information that's sort of taken off the table. And as you sort of own your data as the city later on in the project, maybe you're the county and you've procured one solution, and maybe like the Bayer City in your county has procured a separate solution. Both those systems use MDS. So if you are using the data sets from both of those within your civic government, you're now not in a total apples to oranges scenario. Especially as you might see, you know, one scooter zoom across different boundary lines or things. And it's less about that one, you know, I think it's less about like managing that one vehicle in the sort of the level of sophistication that we have today around data and you know, that type of transportation, but more about like oh, can we compare like to like? And if we're looking at whether it's vehicle miles traveled or the level of like, you know, issues with sidewalk writing, or one, we can both actually have that information in the city and in the state if we're using different solutions. But like the data sets that we're using should be fairly comparable. We're not in like wildly different territories.
I think that's crucially important, and especially when we talk about things like, well, there's the internal government usage sort of thing that you're talking about with MDS, and how do we actually manage what's going on sidewalks and streets. There's also, I think, from a transit perspective, this question of how do people actually find their way wherever it is that they're going, right? Or I mean, more broadly, just how do vehicles get where they're going? There's not really the real existence of some of these government arbitrary lines that exist if you're just a person who's trying to move through space on a transit vehicle. So we deal with that a lot here, and I think one of the important things to remember is that in the absence of that easy exchange of data from different sources, we've sort of seen how that works, and the answer is not very well. And I can use another example from the LA area, which is, of course, a very large urbanized area, one in which many different transit operators are utilizing the roads, and you will find throughout the city, throughout the larger area around the city, examples where you have maybe as many as 10 different transit agencies servicing what is functionally the same stop. So you have all manner of different solutions for how are you going to sign those stops so that individuals know what vehicle is coming, when are they coming, are you getting on a bus that's even operated by the right transit agency? But it's extremely confusing, even under the best scenarios, at least in the absence of that sort of interjurisdictional data sharing. We have things like 3 different poles supporting 3 signs each telling you which routes are going to be stopping here and under what conditions. So the cacophony of information can really be simplified dramatically digitally, and in a situation where all of the digital operators are aware of one another. You avoid the danger, which is that I like to take the scooter example, right? Like if I were in one city and a scooter were riding through and I was perfectly aware of where it is, and then the next city over is not aware of that, then it's as though that scooter just was born fully formed the minute that it crossed the border, right? And so getting that broader context actually opens up an entire world of information that can be used to make people's lives easier.
Yeah, and even worse than the scooter has appeared and reappeared is the worst case scenario that I think we often deal with is a lot of folks have different regulations. A lot of those are now expressed digitally, which is great. Things like, speed limit, especially like speed throttling. So what happens if you, and I will use LA because this is the part, like what happens when jurisdiction 1 has throttled the speed, to 10 and you cross some invisible to you boundary line, your speed throttle is immediately off. You can go back up to 30 and then 5 blocks later, you're out of West Hollywood, you're back in LA proper and you're back down to 10. Like you as the writer are just like, what happened? And that's unsafe and weird and, all those things, and trying to smooth those things out is a hard problem.
Yeah. I just want to note that we're running short on time. If there are any audience questions, we'd love to hear them, try and answer them quickly. Just kind of returning to this conversation about the standardization and what it means for a scooter to cross lines. Ben, you spend part of your time in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands has been experimenting with mobility as a service, which I think is the kind of ultimate, let's say, apotheosis of what we're describing when we talk about data standards, is actually standardizing all transit options into one combined solution, which obviously has massive positive implications for the rider experience, but also can appear quite scary for some of the providers like Uber, who competes on the user interface essentially and the driver network. So Ben, if you could maybe describe a bit of that.
Well, I mean, yeah, I would say that, Netherlands is one among many of the European states that are now trying to push back a little bit on the deployment of micromobility by the private providers, and in general, knit things together into a more resident-centered experience rather than one that's about all of these different shards. I would say, but one of the things that I found really interesting in Sweden actually is that they require their micromobility providers to share their data, and when they do that, the state is able to do things like they have implemented an algorithm that tells them where they should put, they reclaim parking spaces into car parking spaces into micromobility hubs. And part of that algorithm is determined by the use data that they're given by the providers. So there's, in terms of creating an ecosystem where there is, in general, I think that those, especially the shared bike systems where there's both public and a private provider of those, a lot of those, or multiple private providers, a lot of those systems have a platformization element that the state side is working on to make sure that there's kind of a data harness that the private providers can participate in. And, that kind of work is something that really, if you make that promise both to your users, but also to, to the constituents, but also, you require that of your private providers, then it really does, project this kind of, a motivating force to reorganize the sort of data infrastructure on the back end. And, that a lot of times having these types of ecosystemic partnerships drive things forward, between all the actors. So, and something that, has that type of visceral public result where it is about having a mobility as a service, like, a transit planning across multiple different actors, and this type of thing is a very tangible result for the public. And so that serves to feed back into the policy uptake because, there's positive results. And Sweden definitely has made strides in this regard, as has the Netherlands now in there. Netherlands has already come close to a unified transit plan in terms of having a single sign-on for all of the different transit infrastructures with one tap card and this type of thing. And that really required a lot of heavy lifting on the back end of all of those systems, but it was something that was prioritized in the policy. So it's definitely possible, but it's just a question of making sure you have the policy buy-in on all the levels that are necessary.
Sure. Yeah, and we're making small steps in that direction with things like the MDS. I think that's the foundation that you have to be building on. I want to welcome any closing thoughts from people, and before we wrap up our session here. No one, right?
No one else.
Right.
Open source is awesome. Like, I feel like we can all agree on that.
I have been trying to share into the chat a document that we've generated with Matthew's help as well about procurement, looking at procurement in a distributed way and in a way that results in open code and public code, and we'll share that to whatever kind of distribution lists we have after this session. But it definitely is, pertains to all of this. And I think really, the conversation about open data being the real thing that we're looking for here, like you said, Ryan, I think that's above all, you can't, there can't be services that make the data private. That's really crazy. But I think going forward, looking at the idea of solving problems by collaborating on building infrastructure that is useful for everyone and guarantees that, the lock-in won't happen, and there's inclusiveness that we can look at that isn't the sort of thing that the market can address, I think is super important to think about.
Yeah. That's great.
I'll just say, in terms of final thoughts, both myself and Ryan are part of a group called the Mobility Data Interoperability Principles. And this is a multi-state and actually international coalition working on these issues, trying to spread not just awareness, but also resources for public agencies to use to get products that are interoperable and to work with vendors that support interoperability. So our website is interoperablemobility.org, and you can definitely reach out to me as well. I'm happy to provide any more information on that.
Thank you, Scott. That's fantastic. All right, well, I really appreciate all of your contribution. I've learned a lot today, and I think this is starting point for perhaps more collaboration. But I really appreciate your time, your thoughts, your expertise. I appreciate the work that you're doing, each of you in your corner of this mobility and data space.